Now let us move on to soldering tools. Learning how to solder with proper soldering techniques is a fundamental skill every maker should master. In this lesson, we outline the basics of soldering iron, soldering stations, types of solder, desoldering, and safety tips. But first, let me discuss what is soldering. If you were to take apart any electronic device that contains a circuit board, you'll see the components are attached using soldering techniques. Soldering is the process of joining two or more electronic parts together by melting solder around the connection. Solder is a metal alloy and when it cools, it creates a strong electrical bond between the parts. Even though soldering can create a permanent connection, it can also be reversed using the soldering tool as described below. So here are the soldering tools. The good thing about learning how to solder is the fact that you don't need a lot to get started. Below, we will outline the basic tools and materials you will need for most of your soldering projects. The first one is soldering iron. A soldering iron is a hand tool that plugs into a standard 120 voltage alternating current outlet and heats up in order to melt solder around electrical connections. This is one of the most important tools used in soldering, and it can come in a few variations such as pen or gun form. For beginners, it's recommended that you use the pen style soldering iron in the 15 watts to 30 watts range. Most soldering irons have interchangeable tips that can be used for different soldering applications. Be very cautious when using any type of soldering iron because it can heat up to 896 degrees Fahrenheit, which is extremely hot. The second one is soldering station. A soldering station is more advanced version of the basic standalone soldering pen. If you are going to be doing a lot of soldering, these are great to have as they offer more flexibility and control. The main benefit of a soldering station is the ability to precisely adjust the temperature of the soldering iron, which is great for a range of projects. These stations can also create a safer workspace as some include advanced temperature sensors, alert settings, and even password protection for safety. Soldering iron tips. At the end of most soldering irons is an interchangeable part known as soldering tip. There are many variations of this tip and they come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Each tip is used for a specific purpose and offers a distinct advantage over another. The most common tips you will use in electronic projects are the conical tip and the chisel tip. So what is conical tip? Conical tip, this is used in precision electronic soldering because of the fine tip. Because of its pointed end, it's able to deliver heat to smaller areas without affecting its surroundings. And the other one is chisel tip. This tip is well suited to soldering wires or other larger components because of its broad, flat tip. The brass or conventional sponge. Using a sponge will help to keep the soldering iron tip clean by removing the oxidation that forms. Tips with oxidation will tend to turn back and not accept solder as it did when it was new. You could use a conventional wet sponge but it tends to shorten the lifespan of the tip due to expansion and contraction. Also, a wet sponge will drop the temperature of the tip temporarily when wiped. A better alternative is to use a brass sponge as shown on the left. The next one is the soldering iron stand. A soldering iron stand is very basic but very useful and handy to have. This stand helps prevent the hot iron tip from coming in contact with flammable materials or causing accidental injury to your hand. Most soldering stations come with this built-in and also include a sponge or brass sponge for cleaning the tip. And the next one is solder. Solder is a metal alloy material that is melted to create a permanent bond between electrical parts. It comes in both lead and lead-free variations with diameters of 0.001 0.32 inches and 0.062 inches being the most common. Inside the solder core is a material known as flux which helps improve electrical contact and its mechanical strength. For electronic soldering, the most commonly used type is lead-free rosin core solder. This type of solder is usually made up of a thin copper alloy. You can also leaded 60 by 40 or 60% tin and 40% lead rosin core solder, but it's becoming less popular due to health concerns. If you do use lead solder, make sure you have proper ventilation and that you wash your hands after use. When buying solder, make sure not to use acid core solder as this will damage your circuits and components. Acid core solder is sold at home improvement stores and is mainly used for plumbing and metalworking. As mentioned earlier, solder does come in a few different diameters. The thicker diameter solder, which is the 0.62 inches, is good for soldering larger joints more quickly, but it can make soldering smaller joints difficult. For this reason, it's always a good idea to have both sizes on hand for your different projects. The next one is helping hand or the third hand. A helping hand is a device that has two or more alligator clips and sometimes a magnifying glass or light attached. These clips will assist you by holding the items you are trying to solder while you use the soldering iron and solder. A very helpful tool to have in your maker space. Now that you know what tools and materials are required, it's time to briefly discuss ways of staying safe while soldering. Soldering irons can reach temperatures of 800 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's very important to know where your iron is at all times. We always recommend you to use a soldering iron stand to help prevent accidental burns or damage. Make sure you are soldering in a well-ventilated area. When solder is heated, there are fumes released and that are harmful to your eyes and lungs. It's recommended to use a fume extractor, which is a fan with a charcoal filter that absorbs the harmful solder smoke. You can visit sites like Integrated Air Systems for air filtration systems. It's always a good idea to wear protective eyewear in case of accidental splashes of hot solder. Lastly, make sure to wash your hands when done soldering, especially if using lead solder. Thinning the tip. Before you can start soldering, you need to prepare your soldering iron by thinning the tip with solder. This process will help improve the heat transfer from the iron to the item you're soldering. Thinning tip or thinning will also help to protect the tip and reduce wear. Step 1. Begin by making sure the tip is attached to the iron and screwed tightly in place. Step 2. Turn on your soldering iron and let it heat up. If you have a soldering station with an adjustable temperature control, set it to 400 degrees Celsius or 752 degrees Fahrenheit. Step 3. Wipe the tip of the soldering iron on a damp wet sponge to clean it. Wait a few seconds to let the tip heat up again before proceeding to step 4. Step 4. Hold the soldering iron in one hand and solder in the other. Touch the solder to the tip of the iron and make sure the solder flows eventually around the tip. You should thin the tip of your iron before and after each soldering session to extend its life. Eventually, every tip will wear out and will need replacing when it becomes rough or pitted.